state for numerous counties, and I am now the Deputy District Attorney in Atlanta, and I run the largest appellate division in the Southeast. I have 12 attorneys who I lead and manage, everyone from right out of school to retirement age. And our unit primarily analyzes laws and reviews legislation from the General Assembly and challenges to those legislations in the appellate courts, and we argue our positions in the Court of Appeals and Supreme Court. And so through this position, I've had an opportunity to take my passion for the law and for public service and serve my state and my county. And it's this passion that's galvanized me to run for this race. I have been honored to serve my county, but I'm very excited about the opportunity to serve on a more granular, direct level with each and every one of you and to make a difference directly in my neighbor's life. And I've decided that the time to do that is right now, because I think we're seeing all too frequently that crime is on a rise in our district. With the shootings at the mall and Lenox and Buckhead, we shouldn't be afraid to take our family members, our children out into our community. And this really is not a partisan issue. It's not Republican, it's not a Democrat issue, it's not a Black issue, it's not a white issue, it's not a male or female issue. Every single person has the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness and to feel safe in their homes. And this is really about putting the right person in the right position to keep our community safe. My opponent has no experience in this. I have been on the forefront of fighting crime for over a decade, and I know how to keep our community safe, and I have a track record of doing that. Recently, my husband and I, in the last few years, had children, and we had an opportunity to move into a metro county, and we chose this district because of the community atmosphere and because it's the economic engine of this state and for the amazing education system. And my husband is a businessman. My parents both own their own small businesses. And so I've sat around those dinner tables and had those discussions about how hard it is for my parents to run a small business. I know really better than anyone the grit, the hard work, and the challenges that our small business leaders face. And the challenges that they've seen recently have been tremendous with COVID and with the looting that happened last Friday night. And that community, our small business community, our business leaders deserve a leader in the General Assembly who's going to protect them and who's going to fight for our economy. I also moved into this district, as I just mentioned, because of the education system. And I think we're going to have to make some very difficult decisions due to our current state economic situation. And I want to do my best to ensure that our education system continues to get the resources that it deserves. I'm not sure how many of you listening are parents, but I have a new all-time respect for teachers after trying to homeschool my toddlers and my 4.5-year-old. And I think our teachers deserve the biggest pat on the back, and we've got to make sure we give them the resources they need. But ultimately, it's this drive and this passion to serve. It's this connection that have seen in my experience that our education system, our public safety, and our economy are all intricately linked. And I have the skills necessary and the passion to represent each of you in the General Assembly.
Well, thank you so much, Lyndsey, for offering yourself to represent us in Buckhead. If you get elected, I'm sure you'll do a great job. And we want to congratulate you on becoming the nominee. You didn't have any opponents, but that's a big accomplishment in and of itself. So we appreciate that. But let's go ahead and get right into it. So obviously, you provide an interesting take on what's been going on as a prosecutor, especially here in Atlanta. And so there's obviously, we all saw on the news, there was the rioting, there was the looting. People want to know kind of your view on what everything's going on. And if, as a prosecutor, are these people going to be held accountable? How are they going to be held accountable? Or are these people from out of state? Do you have any information on that? And just your general thoughts in terms of how are we going to hold these people that just ripped our city apart? How are we going to hold them accountable?
Well, first, I want to say that I'm motivated and inspired by the peaceful protesters and the positive discussion we're having right now. in our nation, in our community. But I want to be crystal clear that I absolutely deplore the looting that happened last Friday night, and really the criminal actors that came in our community and hijacked the peaceful protesters movement and created chaos in our streets. And that's absolutely unacceptable, and they do have to be held accountable. Part of your question was regarding, are these out-of-state actors or in-state actors? And what we're seeing is about 85% of those who were charged and arrested are actually from our communities, from our surrounding neighborhoods. I am very glad to hear that the U.S. Attorney in the Northern District right here in Atlanta, PJ Pack, is going to be investigating, has opened an investigation into really that other 15% is going to be looking at whether or not there were any outside actors or influencers that came into our community to cause harm.
Right, and the Minneapolis City Council, which I'm sure a lot of people have kind of heard about, is this crazy idea about dismantling their own police department. And a lot of people don't know that actually a lot of jurisdictions have done this already, like Los Angeles, for example. But what exactly does that mean? I mean, does that mean the end of a police department? Does it mean that it's just going to take a different form? And what are the implications of dismantling a police department?
You know, I've seen the video of George Floyd's death, and it's horrific. And no one deserves to die that way, whether or not they have a criminal background or not. And unfortunately, I have seen similar incidents in my role as a prosecutor. I'm currently involved in the prosecution and investigation of a potential police brutality case from 2014. And while as a prosecutor, I do not pick my victims or defendants, it doesn't matter to me who they are, whether they're law enforcement or not. My job is to seek justice. And so I do believe that Floyd's family deserves justice. But I do not believe that that includes defunding our police department. What I think that's actually going to lead to is an injustice. Well, if you look at the numbers, we have roughly around 900,000 law enforcement officers across the country. And annually, they have around 450 million encounters with civilians, with each and every one of us. And primarily and predominantly, these are peaceful encounters. These are the encounters that we rely on. These are the encounters that we rely on. These are the calls that we're making in those horrific situations where our children are choking. We need 911. These are our calls that we're making to police officers when there's wrecks on the highway. These are the calls that our domestic violence victims were making, especially during COVID-19, when we saw a really increased risk to our victims in domestic violent disputes. And you know, the people who are promoting defunding the police, what I want to ask them is, who's going to be on the other end of those calls? Who's going to be responsible for protecting the most vulnerable in our community? And that's what I'm concerned about. I'm concerned about the injustice, the disparity that we're going to see, and if we defund our police department. So I absolutely, to be clear, do not support that.
Right, and a few district attorneys across the country, most notably in New York City, Pittsburgh, Los Angeles, have actually come out and have said that they're not going to prosecute certain low-level crimes committed during the protests, like violating the curfew, for example. Paul Howard is the current incumbent here in Fulton County. Has he made any similar comment about not prosecuting certain crimes that were committed during the protests?
I am not privy to any comments that he has made, but I want to point out that a lot of the low-level offenses that you're referring to are misdemeanor cases. And in Fulton County, those cases are handled by our Solicitor General. And so those are decisions that the Solicitor General will make. But as I indicated earlier, I think we absolutely have a responsibility to hold those who committed the looting responsible. I think there should be some reasonable discussion around those more low-lying offenses. If just resolving them through small penalties are fine. We have a large backlog in our criminal justice system, and we really need to reserve those proceedings for those that cause significant damage to our community.
Right, and another important aspect that not a whole lot of people may not know is that police unions are actually some of the strongest in our country. And so as somebody that, if you get elected, how do you balance that line between going ahead and addressing these concerns of police brutality, and also making sure that you support law enforcement?
As I mentioned earlier, we have roughly 1,900,000 law enforcement officers in our country. And while we should never support any form of police brutality, and I don't want to undermine any of those cases, the majority of our officers in our country are doing tremendous work. And I don't want to see the small amount of cases that basically outshadow the tremendous work that our law enforcement does. Just like I don't want to see the peaceful protesters whose movements are being and voice are being heard around the country overshadowed by the individuals who came into our community and tried to hijack that movement. We shouldn't let these outliers define the great and tremendous work that our law enforcement does and the voice of the peaceful protesters.
One policy that is actually getting pretty much like a lot of support is getting rid of qualified immunity. And that's getting bipartisan support up in Washington, D.C. So can you kind of explain what that is? You keep on hearing in the media qualified immunity. Explain what that is and what are the implications of eliminating that?
So I might get a little bit of the weeds here, but I want to take a step back and explain that there are really two different court systems in our legal system. There's the criminal court system and the civil court system. And any officer, whether it's the law enforcement officer, any sovereign who is in a position of power, if they abuse that power, they are absolutely subject to being tried in our criminal system. Qualified immunity does not bar any form of prosecution for an abuse of force. And it's typically charged as a violation of an oath of office, because as public servants and as law enforcement officers, you swear an oath to follow the police procedures, and when you violate those, it's charged as a felony. And that qualified immunity does not deter from that at all. Qualified immunity is a civil doctrine or principle that limits the ability of a person, an individual, to sue someone for a financial or numeric number, essentially. And so it's a penalty, financial penalty, essentially. And so the idea of qualified immunity is that they limit the ability to file civil litigation against public servants. And that gives you an idea of kind of what the term qualified immunity is. And just to kind of share some of my concerns about outright lifting the bar against qualified immunity, as a public servant, I speak for myself and I think many others that we do it out of a desire to serve and not out of financial gain. But what I worry is that we're going to lose so many of our wonderful community actors that help House District 54 in our entire state if they fear being personally sued, if they fear someone coming after their family, their homes, and civil lawsuits. And so you're going to lose some of your best and brightest public servants. Additionally, many of the civil cases that are tied to qualified immunity also bring in the individual's employer. So you would also be suing the municipalities and counties, and they would be responsible for a large part of those financial verdicts. And the difficulty in that is, for Fulton County, an example, they're self-insured. So you could be looking at bankrupting your own county or your own municipality. And if they're financially struggling to pay those verdicts, the last thing I want to see is those high verdicts being paid through increased tax dollars to the constituents and our community members. So there are some policy concerns there that we have to balance with the need to make sure that justice is executed. But again, you're always going to have that criminal realm available. And the civil aspect of qualified immunity is what you're hearing people talk about. I think there are some discussions that could be had about really some exceptions to qualified immunity. They actually are on the federal and state level ways that you can get around qualified immunity, and there are certain cases that are exceptions. And I think we've really got to continue to talk about it and find a good balancing point.
Let's go ahead and switch gears here and talk about the coronavirus, because obviously there's still a very dangerous pandemic going on. And as we saw in May, we actually added 2.5 million jobs in the country, which was a huge upset. People did not think that was going to happen. What do you think about the best way to get the community back up and running, especially Buckhead? You know, you saw some of the rioting, you saw some of the protesting, but how has Atlanta favored with the coronavirus, and especially Buckhead?
Well, first, I want to commend Governor Kemp and Dr. Toomey. I think we've seen a great balance of trying to restore people's livelihoods with protecting those most vulnerable in our population. And I think we're very lucky to have these two leaders at the forefront of this. But I think we have to continue to open up our economy, but do it in a way that protects those that are most vulnerable. I think we have to keep an eye towards the future of what August and the fall is going to look like for our students, and making sure that we can return them safely to our schools. But I think we also have to start asking some serious questions about the economic consequences of COVID. And as you've probably seen, we're gonna have to make 11% cuts in our state agencies. And we're gonna have to find a way to make up for these extra expenses. And we are very blessed in Georgia that the Republican Party has put in place laws that require Georgia to have a balanced budget. We are not allowed to operate in a deficit. And because of the leadership of former Governor Deal and Governor Kemp, we had a very high rainy day or savings account. Well, that's being depleted because of COVID. We're going to have to find extra revenue sources. I think one large opponent between my difference between my opponent and I is I do not believe that the government can spend its way or tax its way out of an economic crisis. I think the best way to do that is to let each and every one of you do it organically. By putting more money in your pocket, you will feel enabled to go out into the community. You'll increase your spending. That increases the state's budget. And that's the best way, I think, to do it, is naturally through the free enterprise. I believe in that, and we've seen it work time and time again.
Yeah, and I think a huge addition to that could be a Republican National Convention coming to the state. And that's something that is on the table. And I think I saw today that Jacksonville's the front running, but it would be great to have it, whether it's in Savannah or in Atlanta. We'll see what happens there. But let's talk a little bit about voting, because obviously yesterday was election day, and there were some very long lines in Fulton County and DeKalb County. I guess I was one of the smarter ones because I voted early. But I mean, for people that waited long, were they? Have you been paying attention to exactly what happened, and how can we fix this for not just in November, but also in August and July for the runoff elections?
First, I share the concerns that you have. I wanted to exercise my right to vote by absentee ballot. So my husband and I, sure, like many of you, took an opportunity to submit a request to get our ballot in the mail. It never came. And a month later in May, I did a request to the Secretary of State's office, and they opened up a claim with the Fulton County Board of Elections, and I never received a response or an email response back. I did ultimately take advantage, as you did, Christian, of early voting, and that process was pretty seamless. And my husband, on the other hand, voted on election day yesterday, and I did hear rumors of very long lines. I've talked to people that waited in those, and I'm very glad that everyone stayed patient. The lines that my husband waited on were not as long, but I think we've got to make sure that the ability for us to all be engaged in our civic process were not deterred by what occurred yesterday. And I'm very hopeful from what Speaker Rawson has called for a very unique, I don't know if you've seen this, a unique measure that's really done more on a federal congressional level, but he's asked for a state legislative investigation of what occurred. And that would be looking at the Secretary of State's office and the Fulton County Board of Elections. But I think there also has to be some answers from the Fulton County Board of Elections as to why they were unable to execute the absentee ballots. What were the issues at the polling booths? We've got to get clarity and resolve it before November. Yeah,
have you heard why there were such big issues? I mean, it seems as though that every election there's a huge issue in Fulton County and DeKalb County. It just can't seem to get it together. I mean, do you know any specifics about why? I've tried to look it up. I can't find out any information about that.
Well, first, I think we saw a combination of the increase in the amount of absentee ballots that requested. The numbers are tremendously higher than in years past, and I think, quite frankly, that overwhelmed election boards. We saw a shift in how and when our elections were going to be due to COVID. But I do not know any specific reasons. So I think that's why we have got to have an investigation. We've got to find out what went wrong. And, I really think it was just a combination of the perfect storm. We've got to dissect it, and we've got to make sure it doesn't happen again.
All right, and then I'm going to get to kind of an interesting question that a lot of people had. They reached out to me and wanted to ask you, and it's a little bit of an outside the box question, but there's been a lot of talk in the last few years about Buckhead becoming its own city. So, it's kind of interesting because, you go to Buckhead, you think it's its own city. It's got a little downtown, and a lot of people that are from out of town, I tell my family, I'm like, yeah, this is still the city of Atlanta technically. So what's your position on that?
I have heard people talk about in the past, and I've of course followed when other cities, John Creek and Brookhaven, had similar movements. But I believe that Buckhead's a great community. We're going to be a great community within Fulton County, within the state. I think it should remain that way.
Okay, so let's go ahead and turn to some of the audience questions. So if you have any questions, and just go ahead and put them on the chat. This is an interesting one. Should there be legislation preventing protests, demonstrations after sunset? And I'll go a step further and say even with masks on, because one of the big things, of course, that we see throughout the country is that Antifa loves to go and start havoc with masks. And it's a little bit, it might be a moot point at this point because of the virus. But do you see any legislation about limiting people's protesting after sunset, or even masks after COVID?
I think there's going to be some serious constitutional barriers to that, specifically the First Amendment. I think you've got to counterbalance that with whether or not there's some type of noise violation or ordinance that would overcome that. But I think you're getting into a very slippery slope of undermining First Amendment rights. But I do think you pointed out something very interesting. We heard a lot from the Democrats who were very vocal against Governor Kemp when he opened up our economy. And when we went to phase 2, we were allowed to congregate in groups of 10. And then, of course, ironically and hypocritically, when the protests began, we didn't hear anything from the Democratic Party. I didn't hear anything from my opponent. She was very adamant against Governor Kemp opening the economy, but has not spoken out against the health concerns of putting thousands, not hundreds, thousands of protesters in a very confined space with many without masks. And I think that she should demand that all the protesters be tested.
This one's from John Bush. Why did you decide to run for a judicial office and a legislative office in the same election cycle?
As the deputy of the appellate unit, I've been practicing appellate law for 10 years, and that means I primarily am in the Court of Appeals and the Supreme Court. And so there was an opportunity for an opening in the Georgia Court of Appeals. There was a judge who was going to leave for another position, and I had never thought of doing anything politically. It's, quite frankly, I think for anyone who's doing it for the first time, intimidating. It's an uncharted territory. So I thought hard about it, and I have a passion for the law. So I entered into the race for the Georgia Court of Appeals, and I found that I loved it. I don't know why I was scared. Once I started, I absolutely loved the process. I had opportunities to speak to groups just like this, to meet people, and it was invigorating. And I really just loved it, quite frankly. And then, unfortunately, the judge whose seat I was running for announced that she was going to stay. And so there was no longer a vacant open seat to run for. And it closed down that election. And so I returned to work for several months and went back to my role prosecuting, and saw this opportunity and wanted to find a way to continue public service and to represent people and use my background and experience in a positive way. And this gave me that opportunity.
This next one's from Katie. If everyone in the U.S. has 1.4 million interactions with the police a year, don't you think we need far fewer laws? We live in a country that prides itself on being free. How do you reconcile being a small government Republican in specific and and an American in general with that stark reality?
First, just to be clear, it's 4.5 million encounters with civilians. And also, those aren't necessarily responses to violations of criminal laws. Those could be health checks, different things that are unrelated to any potential criminal encounter. But listen, I think that the Republican Party and I agree as a member of it, that government usually needs to stay out of things, but we've got to have government and law enforcement protecting our streets. Let's look at Chicago, for example. 2 nights ago, they had the largest amount of murders that they've had in 60 years. 18 people died in 24 hours. If you want to know what our city or what a country would look like without laws, without law enforcement, without law and order, just turn to Chicago. And I don't want to see that on our streets. You know, on last Friday night, I live, if I could turn this camera, probably 100 feet from a large commercial shopping center. And we could hear the shattering of glass and the alarms going off from the loiters breaking in to small business owners' homes, or excuse me, places of work. And I'm going to be quite honest, I've talked to my neighbors, they were scared to death. And I've talked to the business owners and the costs that they've incurred, how hard this has been for them after trying to rebound from COVID. No one should have to go through that. And we have to have a strong police force. And I think, quite frankly, I'll just use Chief Shields' words herself. She fell flat-footed on Friday night. So if we want to know what it would look like without law enforcement and laws, turn to Chicago and turn to last Friday night here in Atlanta, Georgia, in our own backyard of our district. That is unacceptable.
Next one comes from Rachel. What's your very first thing? If you get elected to office, what's on your list of to-dos?
Well, I think and hope that it will already be done, but I think it's high time that Georgia joined the rest of the country in passing a hate crimes law. And I am so inspired by Speaker Ralston and the Republican Party for really being at the forefront of this. And I hope that it passes this session, but if not, that would be something I think that the community and our district really needs to bring everyone back together.
What is your view on no-knock warrants? And I believe was why Breonna Taylor passed away. So what's your view on that?
You know, I think it goes back to let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater. Listen, there are some bad apples. There are always going to be people that execute incorrectly, and it's not acceptable. But we do not need to get rid of no-knock warrants. You've got to look at the tremendous need for those. Many of our end up explain what that is. We have 2 types of warrants in Georgia. We have a knock warrant where you have to knock and announce, and a no-knock where you can go to a home without any or a private place with a warrant that a judge has signed and found probable cause to go into that home, but you do not have to announce yourself first. And then the third way you can go in to a residence or a private place is if there are exigent circumstances. And so that second type, the no-knock warrants, are a huge tool that law enforcement use and need. A lot of our criminals are smart. They know how law enforcement works. They know when there's a knock at the door, how much time they have to flush the cocaine they were getting ready to sell on our streets. And so there is absolutely a need for those. Now, where I think you see a lot of things go wrong is after the no-knock warrant occurs and they go into the home, they've got to deploy force correctly. They've got to take the right measures. But listen, I've been with law enforcement, I've been on the streets, and let me tell you, it is always fluid. You never know what's going to happen. And these officers are putting their lives on the line every time they go to those doors, whether they're knocking or not. And that doesn't mean that we don't have bad apples out there, but we've got to make sure that we support our law enforcement, that we ensure that they have the resources they need to protect us. Now, that might mean that we need to put some more funding and training, and maybe we need to do more training around no-knock warrants, but I don't think we need to jump to eliminating something that is integral in the protection of our community.
This next one's from Adam. Are there any unexpected shifts in your campaign that we didn't see in the primary? that you plan to hit the ground on for your run now in the general election?
And I'm so sorry, Christian, I didn't hear that. Are there any shifts? Is that what you said?
Yeah. Are there any unexpected shifts in your campaign that we didn't see in the primary that you plan to hit the ground on for your run now in the general election?
Well, I'm not really sure what he means by shifts. I'm so sorry. I don't know what he means by that question. Is there any way you could clarify?
I think, are there any other in your? I think what he's trying to say is, and maybe he can, Adam, you can clarify. I think what he's trying to say, are there anything different from the primary to the general election that you're going to be doing?
No, but I think you're going to see a lot more engagement. I'm going to be out more in the community. I'm hoping as we start to see our communities reopen, I'm going to be able to have a lot more engagement. Right now, I have been engaging by phone calls due to the inability to knock on doors, but I look forward to being able to meet with each and every one of the community members and district members. And I hope that that's going to be one of the significant shifts you'll see going into the general.
This next one's from John. Because Beth Baskin, who actually just ran for Supreme Court Justice here in Georgia, she was the last Republican to represent House District 54 in Buckhead. And so John asks, what good tactics from Beth Baskin's winning campaign do you plan to replicate, and what tactics will you improve?
Beth Baskin, I think, was an amazing leader for this district, and Buckhead has always had a history of having incredible leaders with Ed Lyndsey and then Beth Baskin, and I think that's what our district deserves, and we need to return to that, and I will be the same strong leaders that Beth and Ed were for this district that we're currently missing.
This next one is from James Edwards. He says, doesn't the threat of civil suits against police officers personally, as well as municipalities, cause everyone involved to be more careful in performing their duties and in the hiring process? Also, isn't one more likely to prevail in a civil case as opposed to a criminal case, because juries may be reluctant to hold police officers accountable?
Actually, what I've seen in some of the national data that I've researched as a prosecutor, and I want to refer to it, so I'm going to repeat this, but I want to make sure I say it right. But the latest studies from the National Academy of Science actually found that incidents of when the police stop using certain tactics, stop using as much of the tools that they're given in engaging with civilians, we actually start to see the crime rates go up. And so I think that if we take away some of the tools that our officers have and we subject them to civil liability, you're going to see them start to really back up. You're going to see officers leave. You're going to see officers say, this just isn't worth it. And we have to be commending our officers for the good work that they do, and really working to weed out the bad officers. But we have to make sure that we give the support to our officers that are doing tremendous work. And we have to do that by protecting them civilly as well.
This next one is from Katie. What is your view on civil asset forfeiture? Should pro-small government and pro-personal property candidates be supportive of these policies? In essence, this is the government seizing your property without criminal conviction.
So I think you just explained it at the end, but for those who didn't catch it, civil asset forfeiture is essentially a process by which the proceeds of criminal activity are seized or forfeited to a law enforcement agency. Those assets are taken through a civil process by criminal law enforcement agencies, usually by the responding department, so APD, Clayton, whatever the police department is responding. And there is a civil court procedure, due process is provided to the subject of the seizing. And so there's a criminal process that goes on. It's not as simple as just taking the property and absconding and taking off with it. There's a very clear legal procedure that has to occur. And when that process occurs and it's done through the court system, then that property is seized. And there are specific code sections we have in Georgia that lay out what you can do with those funds. Usually they are used to support our communities, and they go right back into our communities.
This next one is, should accused officers be allowed to sit in review of the grand jury investigating them?
So we actually had an overhaul of our statute in Georgia that deals with our grand jury proceedings. And just to take a step back for those who aren't lawyers, in Georgia and federally, there are constitutional rights for a defendant to be tried by a jury of his peers and to be indicted by his peers. So you and our community members are part of grand jurors, and you decide, hear evidence, and decide if a case should proceed to trial. So that's first and foremost what the grand jury proceeding is. There's a statute in Georgia that lays out how those proceedings should occur. And they also have a provision that is specific to law enforcement officers. It was completely redone several years ago, and actually a lot of the law enforcement rights, so to speak, within a grand jury proceeding were eroded and taken away. And so we have seen those drastically decrease. And at this point, a law enforcement officer is only allowed to be in the grand jury setting and hear the evidence at the time.
Okay, and I just have another question or two. There's no more questions on the chat, but I'd just like to get to know you a little bit more. So where would we find you out on a weekend in Buckhead? Where's your spot? Where do you like to hang out in Buckhead?
Pre or post COVID? Well, I would say actually in either aspect, pre or in our new COVID world. One of the reasons I mentioned we moved to this community earlier was just the great community neighborhood, like there are community activities occurring on weekends. I'm part of the Spring Lake neighborhood community, and we do lots of activities. But most likely you would probably find us on the Beltline chasing after our two children who are 2 and 4. And so they'd probably be running in front of bicyclists, causing complete mayhem, but we'd be on the Beltline chasing them. And we probably will be there on Saturday. Just look for the wild children running.
Well, sounds good. Well, that's my last question for tonight. And looks like those are all of the questions here on the chat. So Lyndsey, thank you so much for joining us. This was really a great talk. I want to thank everyone for coming on here tonight. We've got our next meeting, our next BYR event, which is BYR Ladies on Sunday. This coming Sunday, contact Katie Kaiser or Laura Grove. If you want to find out that information, Lyndsey, of course, you're invited, and you can come out if you'd like, and anybody else as well. But well, thank you so much. Stay tuned for our next event in early July, and everyone stay safe. And thank you very much, Lyndsey, for joining us.
Christian, thank you so much. Young Buckhead Republicans, thank you so much. And thank you to everyone that took time to ask me questions. If I didn't get your answer thoroughly answered, please reach out to me. My email on my webpage is my personal email. It's Lyndsey Rudder, L-Y-N-D, not trip, L-Y-N-D-S-E-Y, Rudder @gmail. And let me give you my personal cell phone too. It's 770-313-8265. I want to make sure I answered everyone's questions. And if you have others, please reach out. I can promise you as your representative, I will always be receptive and available. I will answer your calls. I have done that and found pleasure in reaching out to all of my victims and speaking with them. It's really one of the parts I love about public service. So please don't think you're bothering me. Please reach out anytime. And I look forward to hopefully earning your vote and trust in the November election. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. And BYR will be right there helping you get elected, Lyndsey. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Everyone, thank you for coming on, and we'll see you at the next event.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.